The folder arrived on a Thursday afternoon, slid across a boardroom table, by a man who had never once looked Naomi Achterberg directly in the eye. It was cream-colored, heavy stock, embossed with the Whitmore Group letterhead in a gold that had started to look slightly tarnished in certain light. Gordon Whitmore, her father-in-law, patriarch of the family, chairman of the board, placed his fingertips on it the way a man places his hand on a Bible, as though what was inside were sacred. "We think it's time," he said, "to formalize things." Naomi looked at the folder. She did not open it. Her husband, Elliot Whitmore, sat 2 chairs to her left and studied the grain of the oak table as though it contained a secret worth decoding. He had not looked at her since they'd walked in. She had noticed that. She always noticed things that other people assumed she wouldn't. "Take your time reviewing it," Gordon said. "We've had our lawyers draft it carefully." What the folder contained was a postnuptial agreement, 41 pages of carefully architected language designed to ensure that if the marriage ended, for any reason, under any circumstance, Naomi would leave with exactly what she had come in with, nothing. She was 38 years old. She had been married to Elliot for 4 years. She had spent those 4 years attending Whitmore family dinners in their Rosedale mansion, smiling across tables at people who addressed questions about the business to Elliot while she was still mid-sentence, and listening to Gordon's wife, Patricia, describe Naomi's career in environmental consulting as a lovely little hobby. She picked up the folder, tucked it under her arm and said, "I'll read it tonight." Gordon nodded, satisfied. Patricia, who had been silent in the corner with her tea, allowed herself a small smile. What neither of them knew, what they had never taken the time to learn, was that Naomi had already read a version of this document 6 weeks ago. A source she trusted had forwarded her a draft. She had taken it to her own lawyer, a woman named Constance Birch, who worked out of a quiet office on Bay Street and had spent 30 years making sure people like Naomi didn't get quietly disappeared from the things they'd built. What Gordon and Patricia also did not know, what Elliot, to his credit, only half suspected, was who Naomi Achterberg actually was. Not the woman who sat across from them at Christmas dinner. Not the woman who said, "That sounds wonderful," when Patricia suggested the caterer for their anniversary party. Not the woman who had, 4 years ago, walked into the Whitmore family home in a simple gray dress and been assessed, in under 3 seconds, as manageable. They did not know about the trust. They did not know about her grandmother, and they certainly did not know what Naomi had spent the past 8 months quietly, methodically doing with it. Naomi grew up in Sudbury, the only child of a geologist and a high school librarian. Her grandmother, Eunice Achterberg, had emigrated from the Netherlands in 1962 with $40, a sewing kit, and a ferocious instinct for undervalued real estate. By the time Naomi was born, Eunice owned 11 properties across northern Ontario and kept the documentation in a fireproof lockbox under her kitchen sink. She did not trust banks. She did not trust lawyers, especially not ones who spoke too quickly. She did trust Naomi, whom she called her little auditor from the time Naomi was 7. Because Naomi would sit beside her at the kitchen table on Sunday afternoons and review the ledgers, without being asked, pointing out inconsistencies with the same calm certainty other children used to report on what they'd had for lunch. "You have your grandfather's eyes," Eunice used to say. "He could see through walls." What Eunice left Naomi when she died 11 years ago was not just the properties. It was the trust she had spent a decade quietly constructing around them, a structure so careful, so deliberately obscured behind numbered companies and holding entities, that even the estate lawyer who handled the probate missed 2 of the assets entirely. Naomi had not corrected him. She had kept the trust. She had grown it. She had done this the same way her grandmother had done everything, without announcing herself. By the time she married Elliot Whitmore in a small ceremony at a vineyard outside Niagara-on-the-Lake, Naomi Achterberg's trust held interests in 14 commercial properties, a mid-sized logistics firm, and a controlling stake in a land parcel outside of Barrie that 3 developers had been quietly circling for 2 years. Elliot knew she had some family money. He had never asked how much. It had not seemed important to him. She had noticed that too. What the Whitmore family had was a name and a building. The building was a 12-story office tower in the financial district, acquired by Gordon's father in the 1980s, and it remained the crown jewel of the Whitmore Group's portfolio, which had otherwise contracted significantly over the past decade. Gordon had made 3 major acquisitions in the early 2000s that had not performed: a retail holding company that hadn't survived the shift to e-commerce, a stake in a mining operation in northern Quebec that had produced 2 years of litigation and a settlement that nobody discussed, a commercial real estate venture in Hamilton that sat half vacant. The building, officially known as Whitmore Tower, was mortgaged, not devastatingly, but meaningfully. There were also 2 significant credit facilities against the holding company, and a deferred tax liability that Gordon's accountant had been restructuring for the better part of 3 years. Naomi had known most of this before she signed the wedding guest book. Not because Elliot had told her, He hadn't, not really, not in any detail, but because she had asked the right questions of the right people, quietly, in the months before the wedding. She had a friend from her consulting years, a forensic accountant named Sasha, who had a talent for reading corporate filings the way other people read novels. Sasha had spent a weekend with the Whitmore Group's publicly available documents and called Naomi on a Sunday night with the summary. "They're fine," Sasha had said, "for now. But the tower is carrying a lot of weight and the rest of the portfolio is thin. If anything shifts, interest rates, occupancy, anything, they're going to feel it." "And the family?" Naomi had asked. "Personally? Gordon's got the Rosedale house and his pension and a lot of ego invested in the name. Elliot owns a condo that's mortgaged. Patricia has some inheritance from her side, but it's in GICs, they're comfortable. They're not rich the way they think they are." Naomi had thanked her and gone for a walk along the lakeshore and thought about her grandmother's kitchen table and the Sunday afternoon ledgers, and what it meant to actually understand a thing versus simply having the appearance of understanding it. She married Elliot 3 months later. She loved him, in the complicated way you love someone who is fundamentally decent but has lived his whole life inside a story that was written for him. She wanted the story to be different. She had believed for a while that she could help write a new one. That belief had lasted approximately 18 months. The trouble was not dramatic, it never is in marriages like this. There was no single event, no blow-up that could be pointed to later as the moment. There was instead an accumulation of small surrenders, moments when Elliot stood at a fork in the road and chose the direction that required less courage. There was the dinner at the Rosedale house where Gordon made a comment about Naomi's consulting work, specifically about a project she had spent 8 months on, a remediation assessment for a mining site in the Sudbury Basin, and called it admirable in a volunteer sort of way. Elliot had laughed, not a big laugh. A small laugh, the kind you deploy to smooth over a room. But a laugh. There was the Christmas where Patricia gave Naomi a cookbook and gave Elliot's sister Margos a piece of jewelry from a designer Naomi had once mentioned she admired. Naomi had said nothing. Elliot had not noticed. There was the night Naomi came home from a site visit near Timmins, exhausted and carrying 2 weeks of field notes, and found Elliot on the phone with his father, and heard Gordon's voice through the receiver say, "She's not really a partner in the business sense, is she?" And heard Elliot say quietly, No, she's not involved." She had stood in the hallway with her coat still on for a long moment. Then she had gone to the kitchen and made tea and opened her laptop and written an email to Constance Birch. The email said, "I'd like to review my options." Constance Birch had short gray hair and a habit of leaving long silences after things were said. Silences that initially felt like she hadn't heard you, and eventually revealed themselves to be the most productive part of the conversation. They met at Constance's office on a Tuesday morning in February, the lake invisible behind the gray weather, the city muffled and gray. "Tell me everything," Constance said. "Don't edit." Naomi told her everything. The trust, the properties, the logistics firm, the Barry parcel, the mortgage on Whitmore Tower, the credit facilities, the deferred tax liability, Gordon's retail failure and the Quebec mining settlement. Elliot's Constance listened without writing anything down. At the end she sat for a moment in one of her silences. "They don't know," she said. It was not a question. "They know I have some family money," Naomi said. "They've never asked for details. Why not?" Naomi thought about it. Because it didn't seem important to them. People like the Whitmores don't ask questions about other people's money. They assume it can't be significant enough to matter. Constance looked at her steadily. "What do you want to happen?" "I want to be prepared," Naomi said. "For whatever happens." What happened 6 weeks later was the cream-colored folder. Naomi read the postnuptial agreement twice that night, once quickly and once slowly with Constance's prior notes beside it. The document was comprehensive, well-drafted, and built on a premise so foundational to its entire structure that Naomi almost felt a kind of professional admiration for how thoroughly it would fall apart. The premise was this, that Naomi had nothing of substance to protect. The agreement was designed essentially to ring-fence the Whitmore Group assets from any claim Naomi might make in the event of separation. It was thorough on that point. What it did not do, could not do because the drafting lawyers had clearly never imagined it was necessary, was address the possibility that Naomi might have her own assets worth protecting. It said in 41 pages of careful language exactly nothing about the trust. It said nothing about the 14 properties. Nothing about the logistics firm. Nothing about the Barry parcel, which had, in the past 6 weeks, received a formal acquisition offer from a developer in Mississauga, at a price that made Constance exhale audibly when Naomi forwarded it. The Whitmore Group lawyers had drafted a document to protect Gordon's assets from Naomi. What they had actually produced was a document that, if signed, would legally acknowledge that Naomi's separate property, her trust, her holdings, was entirely hers, untouched, and would remain so. She called Constance at 9:30 that night. "I see it," Constance said before Naomi had finished explaining. They're trying to protect themselves from me, Naomi said. But the document is so focused on their assets that it essentially creates a legal framework that protects mine. More than that, Constance said. If you sign this and the marriage ends, you walk out with full, documented, legally acknowledged control of everything in the trust. They've actually made it cleaner for you than if there were no agreement at all. There was a pause. Should I sign it? Naomi asked. Another pause from Constance. I think, she said slowly, that you should understand exactly what you're signing before you do. And I think they should too. But I also think, she stopped. What do you want the end of this story to look like? Naomi looked out her apartment window at the city. She and Elliot had been in separate bedrooms for 3 weeks. It had not been discussed. It had simply happened the way everything in their marriage happened toward the end. By accumulation, by small surrenders, until suddenly you looked up and the geography had changed. I want it to be honest, she said. That's all I've ever wanted. She returned the folder to Gordon at a family dinner 2 weeks later. It was a Sunday Rosedale, the dining room with the Bradshaw portraits and the chandelier that Patricia insisted on keeping, even though it had needed rewiring for 2 years. Gordon sat at the head of the table, Patricia at the other end, Elliot to Naomi's left doing what he always did at these dinners, which was occupy space without quite inhabiting it. Naomi had brought Constance's letter. It was 3 pages. It outlined, in measured and specific language, the nature and value of Naomi's trust, its structural independence from any marital asset, and the legal position that the proposed postnuptial agreement, as drafted, would in fact formalize and protect that trust in ways advantageous to Naomi. It also noted, in the second paragraph, the current assessed value of the trust's holdings. Gordon read the first page. His expression did not change. He turned to the second page. Something shifted in his face. Not dramatically, more like a rearrangement of small muscles that he was trying very hard to control. Patricia had stopped eating. Elliot was looking at the letter now too, and Naomi watched him read the number on the second page and watched something cross his face that she could not quite name. Surprise, yes, but also something that might have been shame. This is your... Gordon started. My grandmother's trust, Naomi said, that I've been managing for 11 years. You never mentioned, you never asked, she said. Not sharply. Not with any particular edge. She said it the way you state a simple fact about the weather. Gordon set the letter down. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Naomi, really looked at her, possibly for the first time. The postnuptial, he said, is very thorough, Naomi agreed. Your lawyers did careful work. Constance's letter explains what it actually protects. The silence in the room was the particular kind that doesn't recover easily. Patricia reached for her wine and then seemed to think better of it. Elliot said her name, just her name, quietly, as though it were a question. I know, she said. She wasn't sure what she was answering, maybe all of it. They did not sign the postnuptial agreement. This was Gordon's decision, made after 2 days and a lengthy call with the family lawyers during which someone apparently asked whether Naomi had any interest in the Whitmore group specifically, and some else had to explain that based on the trust structure, she didn't need it. There was a meeting, just Gordon and Naomi, no lawyers, no Elliot, at a coffee shop on Yonge Street that was nobody's territory. Gordon arrived first. He had ordered a black coffee and he was sitting with his hands around the cup like a man who was figuring something out. He did not apologize. She had not expected him to. Men like Gordon Whitmore did not apologize. They recalibrated. What he said was, I underestimated you. Yes, she said. Elliot. He stopped. Started again. I'm not sure Elliot understood either, I know. Are you going? He didn't finish the question. She looked at him across the small table. He was, she thought, not an evil man. He was a man who had spent his entire life inside a story about who mattered and who didn't, and he had never once been given a reason to question the casting. That was its own kind of poverty. I haven't decided, she said. She meant about the marriage, about Elliot, about all of it. She genuinely hadn't. What she had decided was this. She would not make the decision from a position of fear or weakness or the feeling of having no options. She would make it clearly, with full knowledge of what she held and what she didn't need. Her grandmother had told her once, at that kitchen table, that the most dangerous thing a woman could do was let other people's assumptions about her become her own. Eunice had said it in Dutch first, then translated, because some things didn't land quite right in English. Naomi had thought about it for 30 years. In the months that followed, the Whitmore group hit the turbulence that Sasha had predicted. Interest rates did what they did, and one of the major tenants in Whitmore Tower, a financial services company that occupied 3 floors, announced a lease reduction. The occupancy math tightened. The credit facilities became less comfortable. Gordon hired a restructuring consultant. Naomi heard about it through Elliot, who mentioned it the way he mentioned most things now, carefully as though testing weight before committing to a step. She and Elliot were still married, technically. They had had, over the course of several months, a series of honest conversations of the kind they probably should have had years earlier. The conversations were hard. Some of them were devastating in the way that honesty is devastating when it arrives late. Elliot said things she had needed to hear. She said things he had needed to hear. They sat with the silence between the things they said and did not fill it artificially. Whether the marriage would survive was genuinely unclear. They were still figuring it out. That part was not resolved. That part was real life, which does not resolve on schedule. What was resolved was something else. A company that Naomi had been in discussion with for 7 months, a mid-sized property development firm based in Waterloo, had, after considerable negotiation, entered into a joint venture agreement with her trust. The venture involved the Barry parcel, which was to be developed into a mixed-use residential and commercial property. The terms were favorable. Constance had reviewed them 4 times. The project was expected to break ground in the spring. There was also a smaller thing, which was perhaps the thing Naomi thought about most. Gordon, in the course of trying to stabilize the Whitmore Group's finances, had reached out to her, through Elliot awkwardly, to ask whether she had any interest in the logistics firm. Not in acquiring it, just in whether it served any of the sectors she worked with, whether there might be a referral opportunity, a connection of some kind. She had thought about it for a week. Then she had made the introduction he needed. Not because she owed him anything. Not because it benefited her directly. She made it because the firm employed 230 people, most of them in Hamilton, and because her grandmother had always said that what you do with power matters more than the having of it. The introduction led to a contract. The contract stabilized one line of the Whitmore Group's revenue. Gordon sent a handwritten note afterward. 3 sentences. She kept it on her desk. Not because she had forgiven everything. Not because the years of small dismissals and quiet condescensions had been erased by a note on cream-colored cardstock. She kept it because it was honest. 3 sentences with no posturing in them, and honesty in her experience was rare enough to be worth holding on to. The Barry project had a name by the fall, Eunice Commons. Naomi had named it without consulting anyone, without running it past a branding team, without checking whether anyone else would appreciate the reference. She drove up alone one Saturday in October, when the tree line along the highway was doing the thing it does in Ontario, in autumn, burning orange and gold against a sky the color of old pewter. She parked on the muddy edge of the property, which was still just a field with survey stakes and the ghost of a plan. She stood there, for a while. She thought about her grandmother in the kitchen with the ledgers. She thought about the fireproof lockbox under the sink. She thought about being 7 years old and being trusted with numbers that mattered. She thought about a cream-colored folder being slid across a boardroom table by a man who had never looked at her directly. She thought about the moment she had walked in that day with Constance's letter and watched Gordon Whitmore read the second page. There was a line her grandmother used to use in Dutch that translated roughly to, "They built the fence to keep you out, but they forgot to check who owned the land." Naomi stood in the field until the cold started to come in properly off the north, the kind of cold that means it. Then she got in her car and drove back south. The field behind her held its silence, the way land does, patient and indifferent, waiting for what gets built on it next.